Hi all, welcome to ESI Cloud Trainings. My name is Shalini Neralla. Let's get started with Boomi Atomsphere Basic Training Day 14 session. So far we've discussed about the basic concepts. So we'll now discuss about the advanced concepts called web services. So let's throw some light on what web services are. This is for people who are new to the concept of web services. So in order to understand the further topics, one should be very clear with this, right? So let's start. What web services are? They are nothing but the services available over the web. They enable communication between applications over the web. They provide a standard protocol or format for communication. Using web services, two different applications can talk to each other and exchange data or information. Right? Say, for example, you have an application built with Java on a Linux platform and it is using Oracle database as its backend. And there is one more application built on C++ over Windows platform and it is using MySQL database. And now if these two applications have to communicate with each other over the internet, then the web services makes it possible. With the help of web services, they'll be able to communicate with each other. Right? And now that we got to know that web services are the services available over the web, there should be someone providing these services, right? So they are nothing but the service providers. The service provider or the server is the entity that develops or implements the application and makes it available over the internet. Clear? So now since we have the provider, we now need to have someone to consume it, right? So that is called service consumer or client. The client sends the request to the server and the server or the service provider processes that request and sends the response back to the client. This is how the communication takes place. And in order to enable the communication, we need to have two things. They are the medium and the format. For example, consider a phone call. Here, in order to enable the communication, we'll need phone, which is the medium, and the language that is understood by both the callers, which is the format. So for the web services to communicate to each other, they will need HTTP or internet as medium and the language XML or JSON as the format. Now the next question will be how these web services are implemented. So they are implemented in two ways. One is SOAP, which is Simple Object Access Protocol, and REST, which is Representational State Transfer. So in SOAP, it allows HTTP only post operation. Post method only it supports. And the format, it supports only XML. Clear? Whereas coming to REST, it supports HTTP, all options like post, get, delete, type, all these different types it allows. And format, XML, JSON, text, anything it accepts. So now you can see that REST is more flexible and less rigid. Clear? So let's now discuss more about SOAP web service. Okay. So what is a SOAP web service? A web service that follows some guidelines led by SOAP web services specification is called a SOAP web service. Now you might get a doubt, what are these guidelines and who defines them, right? So there is an international body that develops open standards for World Wide Web called W3C, World Wide Web Consortium. So, and what are these rules? They are the SOAP web service specifications, which are of two types, basic and extended. So these extended are used for enterprise level. Under basic, we have SOAP, WSDL, and UDDI. We'll discuss more about all these three. So let's start with SOAP web service. So what are SOAP web services? They are the protocols or rules that defines how two applications will talk to each other over the web. All the information or message exchange happens over a common format called XML. These XML messages will have a defined structure called SOAP message. The SOAP message consists of envelope, header, and body. So the envelope acts as a wrapper around the request or response. And the header, it contains application specific information like the authentication, payment, etc. And coming to the body, it contains the actual message that is intended for the endpoint. Clear? And the attachments, the payload for the SOAP message often includes a word processing or a PDF document. an image, or another binary file attachment using multi-purpose internet mail extensions. So every SOAP message have to follow this particular structure, and it is one of the specification. Clear? Then comes the WSDL. So now, if you are a service consumer and you want to make use of a web service, then you need to know all the details about the web service, right? So you need to know what does that web service do, how to consume it, what are the parameter it accepts, what are the return types, etc. So in order to make all this clear, every service provider publishes a description about his web services. And this will act as an interface to the web service where all the attributes and functionalities of that web service are described. This is an XML based interface called WSDL, Web Services Description Language. This can be interpreted with some tools that can display the attributes and functionalities of the web service, and it generates request and response for you. The most used tool is called SoapUI. So the WSDL acts as an interface for the web service, and the service provider creates this interface for his web service, and the service consumer can get the WSDL and understand the request and response parameters. Clear? Now you might get a doubt how the consumer gets to know about that WSDL. So there are two ways which they can get to know. If the server and client know each other, they can directly exchange the WSDL with each other. If the server and client doesn't know each other, then the web service provider publishes his web service on an online directory from where the consumers can query and search for the web service. This online registry or directory is called UDDI, Universal Description, Discovery and Integration. It is an online directory where the provider can publish the WSDL and consumer can query and get hold of the WSDL and use it to call the web service. So these are the different specifications led by the international body called SOAP specifications. So all those web services that follow these specifications is called a SOAP web service. This is clear. Now we'll learn about REST web service. So a web service that communicates between two applications using the principles of REST architecture is called a REST web service. Clear? You might get a doubt now, what is REST and what are these rules that should define or to become a RESTful web service, right? So REST stands for representational state transfer. It is an architectural style. Unlike SOAP, REST is not a protocol. There are no strict specifications. There is no central body that is controlling the specifications. REST is a design principle. You can use these principles or design methods to create a service. And when we use these principles while designing the web services, we get RESTful web services. Right? Now we'll discuss about the principles. So these are the 5 principles that are available. The first and foremost comes the uniform interface. Under that, we have identification of resources. So each resource has a URI and is accessed through a defined set of HTTP methods. And then comes manipulation of resources using representations. Each resource can have one or more representations, such as application by XML, application by JSON, text by HTML, etc. Clients and servers decide to select the representation. And then comes the select descriptive message. The request and response contain not only the data but additional headers describing how the content should be handled. Say for example, response should be cached or no, request must be authenticated or no, etc. And the second principle is stateless. The server should not require to store the state of the session. Each request from the client to the server must contain all of the data that is necessary to handle the request. No need of storing any state on the server. This makes every request from client independent and a complete in itself. Say for example in Flipkart, the cart information is stored in client side but not on the server side. Only that information that is ready for payment will be sent to the server. Right? And third principle is caching. So this defines how the client and server will communicate. The data within a response to a request must be implicitly or explicitly labeled as cacheable or non-cacheable. Server generates responses that indicates whether they are cacheable or not to improve the performance by reducing the number of requests for duplicate resources. Server does this by including a cache control in the HTTP response headers. The client uses cache control header to determine whether to cache the resource or not. In RESTful web services, this coordination between client and server is essential for being stateless. Clear? So the fourth principle is layering. So multiple layers can exist between client and the server. These are called the HTTP layers. These layers can be used for message translations or improving performance with caching, etc. We can also have layers like proxies and gateways as well. A client may send the request to a proxy server instead of the main server. The proxy server will then evaluate the request to simplify or control its complexity, etc. And gateways may be used for managing traffic on the network, protocol translations, etc. We can also have layers like caching. For example, we use a layer that can cache a response and store it for an hour. And if a new request comes from the client with no change in response within an hour, the cached response will be sent from the intermediary server without it going to the main server. Clear? And then the fifth principle is code on demand. This is actually optional. So this allows or provides ability to download and execute code at the client side. The code on demand constraint allows clients to be extendable by downloading and executing code. Say for example, client requests for a resource and the server returns resource with some JavaScript. Right? So these are the REST principles, and a web service that follows these principles will form a REST web service. Clear? Then the REST request formation will be in a single line. So it's a single URL. This is the example of it. And coming to the REST authentication, since there is no REST web service standard, the way a particular web service authenticates request may vary. These are the different REST authentication types. So basic, where you'll have to pass the username and password, and OAuth, where upfront handshake communication with web service is required to establish the access token. And then none. So here no authentication is required, but if required, an API key will be provided within the HTTP request. So the example for that is this. You'll pass the API key with a question mark and the value. Clear? So let's now see how we consume a SOAP web service. Okay. So I have links over here. This is one of the SOAP web service that is exposed. Now we'll try to consume this. Okay. So give this in the browser. So see here, it defines for you the operations that are available: add, divide, multiply, subtract. And if I get this with WSDL next to that, it gives you the WSDL. It should be question mark and WSDL. So see here. So WSDL gives a description of the web service. So it gives you the complete description. What is the min occurs, max occurs, what are the different object types that are available. So the complete information about the web service will be provided in the WSDL. Right? We'll now try to consume this. So as discussed, the most popular tool used to consume is a SoapUI. It is an open source, you can just download. So this is taking time. So this is how the SoapUI looks like. Okay. So this is the SoapUI. Now let me create a project here. Say new and create a new project. So here I can pass the WSDL. I'll just paste the WSDL here. So in most cases, we'll just have to append question mark WSDL. And when you click on OK, So see here, it gives you the definition. So here you have add, divide, multiply, and subtract operations available. Now, if I extend this and if I click on request one, so see here, as soon as we have clicked on request one, you will see the XML message with structure, envelope, header, and body. So this is the SOAP message, and the body contains the actual data required, right? So here we'll pass the numbers. Say I wanted to add 2 and I wanted to add 3. 2 plus 3. So now this is my SOAP message, SOAP request, and when I click on here, you'll see the response. See here, the response 5. So this way we can consume this SOAP web service. Clear? And it allows only XML data. Now we have consumed this using SoapUI. Let's now try to consume this using Boomi. So we'll see how we consume the same SOAP web service using platform, Boomi platform. So let's go back. Let's go back to Boomi platform and create a folder day 14. So we've created and we'll create a process with name web services soap client demo, right? So let me start this with no data. I'll say start and let me create the connector. So I'll use web services soap client. So this is the connector I use to consume the soap web services soap client. And let me give the connection. So connection, you'll have to pass the WSDL URL and soap endpoint URL. So WSDL URL will be this, and in most cases soap endpoint URL will be this without the WSDL. If there is a change, you'll get to know that in the description of that web service, or the client will be providing it to you. Clear? So then here we have different security types like none, basic, etc. In real time, we do not use most of them, but it is good to know about them. So we'll discuss in detail about each one. So none, which means you don't have to provide any login information. And basic, which means you need to pass the basic authentication like your username password. And basic non-preemptive, which means you'll require basic authentication. And this type is available for document literal and RPC literal styles. When selected, a 401 status code is written from the AtomSphere request. After the 401 status return, another request with credentials is sent. These security types allow you to connect to web services that require basic authentication and attempts to set cookies for session maintenance. The basic authentication uses base 64 encoding. It should generally be used when the transport layer security is provided, such as the HTTPS. Clear? Then WS security text password. So this works in conjunction with this WS security tab here. So this, which means the password will be in plain text. So if you see here in WS security tab, if you try to create, say username, you clicked on. So this works in conjunction to what you provide here. It contains password type, username, password, nonce, and created. Clear? So we'll discuss about this. So this we'll discuss later. Let me delete this for now. And WS Security Password Digest. This also works in conjunction with WS Security. The digest authentication communicates credentials in an encrypted form by applying a hash function to the username, password, server supplied nonce values, HTTP methods, etc. Clear? And WS Security Advanced. So Delbumi recommends using this WS Security type when developing new processes instead of text password or password digest. And then comes the HTTP authentication. So the HTTP protocol handler implements these authentication schemes. Clear? So then the user name for the basic non-primitive WS security type should be provided, the username. And then the password also should be provided here. Then comes the client SSL certificate. So this is actually optional. It is used to select a private certificate component for the SSL authentication, SSL client authentication. Whereas this is used for selecting a public certificate for SSL server authentication. So remember that you can add a private or public certificate to web services with the SOAP client connection. So if you're connecting to a secure site like the HTTPS that does not use a certificate signed by a trusted root authority such as VeriSign, obtain a copy of the site's public certificate and import it into your AtomSphere account. So once added to the SOAP client connection, it is applied implicitly whenever the the connector connects to that site. Clear? If site uses trusted root authority, you do not need to import the certificate. It is applied automatically by the AtomSphere. This is clear. Then comes the WS Security tab. Here we have different security options. So username token, timestamp, encryption, and signature. Now let's look into one by one. Username and token. So here you can pass the password type as none, text, and digest. So text which is plain text and digest which means in encrypted format. And then the username for the username token option and the password. And then the nonce which means if this is on, a random value is included in each username token that is sent. Okay. And then the creator. So if this is on, part of the username token is included in the SOAP header as a security block. And this is on by default. Then we have timestamp. So this you can give the time to live. It sets the length of time in seconds that a message is valid before the tag expires. Clear? Then we have encryption. So here we can provide the encrypt certificate, right? So you can browse for a public key encryption certificate and then you can edit if required. Similarly, you can browse for the private key decryption certificate here. And then the key identifier type. So you can select the key identifier types from the below. Then the symmetric algorithm. So it is used to select the symmetric key algorithm for encryption and decryption. You'll be having AES, which means Advanced Encryption Standard, or triple DES, which is triple data encryption. Clear? And then we have key encoding algorithm. So here you can select the RSA, which is reverse Shamir Alderman, or RSA OAP crypto system algorithm for converting encryption and decryption key. And then we have the digest algorithm here. So it is used to select the hash algorithm and for data integrity verification. Clear? Here we have something called add part. So it is used to encrypt only certain parts of the outgoing message. If off, the whole message will be encrypted. And here you can also provide the name, the namespace, and encode. So encode will have two types here, content or element. So you'll enter content to encrypt the inner parts of the element, and you'll enter element if you want to encrypt the whole element. Clear? And then the next will be the signature. So here we'll provide the signing certificate. You can browse for the key store for a signing certificate to sign the outbound message. Right? And signing verification certificate. It is used to browse the key store for a signing verification certificate to verify the signature in the response message outbound. And we have key identifier type. So we can select the key identifier type from here. Then signature algorithm. It is used to select a signature in RSA, DSA, or HMAC, which is reverse Shamir Alderman or digital signature or hash based message authentication code. And then we have signature canonicalization. It is used to select whether to include or exclude a subdocument's comments. Clear? Then digest algorithm. So it is used to select a secure one-way hash algorithm in either SHA or RIPEMD. Right? A secure hash algorithm or race integrity primitives evaluation message digest. Then we have use single certificate here. So this sets the token type. If on, a single certificate token is used, and if it is off, a certificate part token will be used. And again, similarly, add part. Here it is used to sign certain parts of the outgoing message, which is same as what we discussed earlier, right? So these are the different options we have. So let's delete all of them. As told, in real time we don't use all of them, but it is good to know. So let me name this as calculator. Calculator. And security type, we can select none because our web service doesn't require any security. I'll say save and close. And then now I'll create the operation for this. So operation, I can import it. So let me name this as calculator. Calculator web service soap operation. Okay. Let me now import it. I can import either using Cloud Atom or Local Atom. I'll select Local Atom and say Shalini Dev and select your connection. Say next. So it gives you the different object types available: add, divide, multiply, and subtract. I'll select add and say next. Say finish. So see here, the object add, request profile, response profile been created. And here we have return application error responses. So if this is checked, it gives you the error responses generated from the application. Okay. And here we have expose request envelope, which means when this is on, the request profile contains the whole SOAP envelope. And by default, this will be on. And expose response envelope, when on, the response profile contains the whole SOAP envelope without breaking up individual objects. By default, this will be off. And the attachment cache, it is used when receiving SOAP message with MIME attachment. This field specifies the document cache into which the MIME attachments are saved. The document cache components must contain a single index containing the key WSS underscore root underscore document underscore ID, which is a dynamic document property. Clear? So now let's save and close this. And let's place a stop shape here. Say okay. Now I'll need to pass the values, right? So where I can pass the values, I can pass it from parameters. So different ways which we can pass the parameter values. So here I'll select int a and I can give property values or a static value I'll give for now. I'll say 2. And similarly, I will select int b and I'll give the value 3 here. So we've passed the values. Now we'll execute and see. So this is done. Now if you see the value here, you'll be able to see 5, which is the output. So this is clear how we consume a SOAP web service using Boomi. And what are the different other ways which I can pass the parameter? So I can either pass through properties or I'll use a map here. I'll use a map here. So I'll just name this map as a SOAP request map. SOAP request map. And let me create a dummy profile here. I already have a dummy profiles here, dummy flat file profile. And let me select the XML day 14 and you will see the request profile. So I can select the request profile. I can either pass from properties here or I can give default values. So say now I've given 4 and I've given 3. So these two values I want to add. Now just say save and close. This is done. Now let me delete the values I've given here in parameters. So let's save this and execute from here. So see now this is executed and you will now be able to see the output. See here the result 7. So this is how we consume a SOAP web service. This is clear. So let's now try to consume a REST web service. So I'll open this and this is a REST web service. Let me open this and paste this here. See here, it gives an error saying keyless access to Google Maps platform is deprecated. Please use an API key with all your API calls to avoid service interruption. So earlier this was a free web service, but now what restriction we have is keyless access is not allowed. We need to have a API key authentication. Clear? So as we have seen here, how we pass an API key, this is how we pass an API key. Now we'll try to get the API key for this web service. So these are Google Maps API. So I'll go to Google platform, console.cloud.google.com. So see here, you can create a project here, like sample test what I've created, and you can create the APIs and services. If you go here, you'll have something called credentials. So if you click on credentials here, you'll be able to see the screen. So see here, you can create credentials like your API key or auth client ID, service account key. So whatever required. So I've created an API key and this is my API key. So be careful, don't share your API keys with anyone. It should be very confidential. So now that I've got an error here, I will now use API key equal to, and I'll paste this. Now let's see. So now, so there is an issue with this API key. Let me create a new API key. I'll just say create API key. So this is my newly created API key. I can copy it from here. And if I go here, paste this over here and let's say enter. So see now we've got the response. So this is how I'll pass the API key. Clear? Now, similarly like SoapUI, the best tool used for accessing REST services is Postman. For SOAP web services, it is SoapUI, and for REST web services, it is Postman. So this is how the Postman UI looks like. I'll just say close, and you can give a URL here. So just paste whatever we've got from here. Just give it here and say send. So keyless access again. So let me create one more key. Copy, go to Postman and paste the key here and say send. So let's try this now again. So see here, you are able to see the response. Remember, API keys limits will be there, per second limit and all. You'll have to check that for Google Maps. So this is the response you've got for the Google Maps API. So see here, address equal to Hyderabad. So you've got information related to Hyderabad. And if you give Bangalore here, so you'll get information related to Bangalore. And instead of XML, if you place JSON, you'll get the response in JSON format. So see this, if I give the XML format as JSON, you'll get the response in the JSON format. Okay, so either XML or JSON can be provided in a single URL. You can provide the parameters as well, whether address equal to Hyderabad, Bangalore, or which city required, you can provide that. So now that we have consumed this using Postman HTTP client, let's now see how to consume the same using Boomi. Okay, let's go back to the platform. Go back and let me create a process. I'll create a process and I'll name this HTTP client demo. Okay, so let's close this off. I'll use no data in the start shape. Say start, and I'll use HTTP client connector. So the HTTP client connector is used to exchange data with HTTP enabled servers using the HTTP and HTTP protocols. The HTTP client connector is stateless. And because there are no sessions, each document is sent as separate requests in connector shapes and in connector calls. Right? So let's now create the connection. So in connection, you can pass the URL. So usually we'll maintain the basic URL here. So see this, this is constant maps.googleapis.com. So this base URL will be passing here. So this can be HTTP or HTTPS. And then if you see the authentication types here, we have different authentication types. So also it is good to understand what each authentication type does. So let's go through each one, right? So when you say none, which means no login information is required, and basic, which uses base 64 encoding. And here, since the user passwords are not encrypted and the target server is not authenticated, the basic authentication is not secured, right? And if you use password digest, the password digest uses a two-step process that encrypts credentials by applying a hash function to the username and password. The password digest is more secure than the basic authentication. Clear? And then coming to custom, this setting automatically replaces any header or resource path replacement variable named password or username with the respective values from this security section. This is a base URL to which the operation can add via the resource path, right? And coming to NTLM authentication, which means if you have to use NTLM authentication on Windows, Delboomi recommends running the atom or molecule under the account of the currently logged in user. You can then use the NTLM authentication using the Windows user credentials. Clear? So when an atom or molecule runs as a Windows server, it typically runs under a local system account. So this prevents the atom or molecule from using the user account credentials. Instead, it will use the Windows user credentials. And to successfully use NTLM authentication, consider running the atom or molecule as a desktop application from the atom home bin directory, or run the atom or molecule as a service under the country logged in user. Clear? And then comes the OAuth authentication. So Dell Boomi Atomsphere supports OAuth authorization for versions 1.0 and 1.0a for both on-premise and the cloud integrations. Clear? So here we'll be passing all this information, the request token URL, which we pass the URL to obtain an unauthorized request token, and the access token, the URL to exchange the user authorized request token for the access token. Authorization URL, here we'll pass the URL to obtain user authorization for the consumer access. And consumer key, a value the consumer uses to identify itself to the service provider. And consumer secret, a secret the consumer uses to establish ownership of the consumer key. Clear? And access token, a value the consumer uses to gain access to the protected resources on behalf of the user instead of using the user service provider credentials. This token may not be required by the website or application. Then coming to token secret, a secret the consumer uses to establish ownership of a given token. This token may not be required by website or application again. Then we have an option here, suppress blank access token. So if this is on, the OAuth header is generated and the empty access token and secret fields are included. And if this is off, the OAuth header is generated but the empty access token and secret fields are suppressed. And we have ream here. Optionally, we can enter a ream the client may request access to. This parameter similar to scope in OAuth 2.0, and it is added to the authorization header most often to identify the caller company ID. And another use is to invoke a REST list for NetSuite. Clear? And then we have OAuth 2.0 here. So for OAuth 2.0 authentication, you may need to specify in the external application the Dell Boomi callback or the redirect URL. The callback URL for Boomi is https://platform.boomi.com/account/account ID/OAuth2/callback. So this is important. This is the primary setting you need to do on the application end. Then over here we have grant type. So under grant type, we have authorization code, resource owner's credentials, and client credentials. So authorization code, here this is the standard three-legged OAuth 2 authorization, where you grant the client an authorization code that can be exchanged for an access token. Whereas resource owner's credentials, here it requires the username and password to be provided, which is the client ID and client secret. So then coming to the client credentials, it uses client credentials to retrieve an access token directly instead of asking for user authorization. This authorization is typically used for administration tasks specific to client. Clear? So then we have the client ID, which is the client ID that you get from the application, and the client secret as well. And then we need to pass the authorization token URL. This is the endpoint URL to use to obtain an authorization token. And then scope. So you can add one or more permissions which are case sensitive and separated by a space to application request URLs. If you change scope permissions, you need to re-authenticate to ensure that all of the requested permissions are granted. So add authorization parameter. So here this parameter is optional. The name and value of extensible endpoint parameters will be passed here, right? And access token URL. So the endpoint address provided by the application to make the API requests. And we have add access token parameter as well. So this is also optional and it contains the name and value of the additional or custom token parameters required by our application. Clear? So then we have access token over here. So this is the encrypted access token retrieved from the application. You can click on generate if you want to generate a new access and refresh tokens. When a new window opens asking you to confirm offline access, then you'll have to click accept. A second message indicates the access token was received and then the access token generation was successful. This is clear? So then we'll see AWS signature. So the Amazon APIs require that each request is sent with a unique signature that is calculated using the contents of the API request. Boomi Atom Sphere can calculate the required signature for each request that is made to the Amazon APIs. This helps decrease development time and improve time to value while integrating with AWS APIs. This connector uses Amazon access keys, which consists of an access key ID and the secret access key. Create these keys using the AWS Management Console and access them from your stored secure location. So here, Amazon AWS access key, you'll have to provide the AWS access key here, secret key here, and AWS service type. It provides the list of all the Amazon AWS services that are available, like the Amazon S3 and the API gateway, etc. You can select the service and the region and then specify the URL to the server in the URL field. Clear? If your service is not available in the dropdown, give it in the custom AWS server. So then if you click on custom over here, you have custom AWS service. So if it is not present, you will be providing it here. And we have Amazon AWS region. So you can select the name of the region in which your account resides. If it is not present again here, you can create custom and provide the region here. Clear? So this is about the different options, authentication types that are available. So let's go back to none. And if you see here, we have SSL options. So you can configure the client certificate authentication and self-signed SSL certificates if they are required by the destination endpoint. You'll check this, use client SSL authorization. So if this is on, the connection adds a private certificate. If your endpoint requires client authentication, use this option and select the certificate. And use trusted SSL certificate. So here you can select the private certificate. It is used to verify your identity when sending the request to the endpoint. To set up a client authentication, you must manually export your public key and provide it to the endpoint owner. And coming to the trusted SSL certificate, you can add the public certificate here. Clear? So you can contact the owner of the endpoint to obtain its public certificate and then import it into a Dell Boomi Atomsphere certificate component. And then coming to the advanced tab here, you can override the default timeouts in the VM options file. If you set a long timeout in the cloud, the process is stopped by the Atom Worker maximum execution time. So you can set all these options here. Remember that the cookie scope is a cookie handler that specifies the persistence of the cookies. Persistence is whether cookies can be reused in multiple sessions and if they can, where they have to be used. You can use trace locking to see if cookie scope is set to connector shape or ignored. So here connect timeout tells the connector how long to wait to complete a connection handshake until it times out without changing the timeouts at atom or operating system level. And if this is blank, the default timeouts are used. If it is 0, timeout is infinite. And then we have read timeout. So this tells the connector how long to wait for an HTTP read request to complete. We also have cookie scope. It is used to set the persistence of cookies. When you select global, cookies are shared in all processes throughout the Atom JVM lifecycle, and this is by default. You can also select connector shape. So there cookies are isolated and shared only to the duration of the connector shape execution. And when you select ignored, the cookies are discarded even if they are requested by the server. This is how it works. And when you use the authentication type as NTLM authentication, so there'll be sometimes a question posted by the interviewer, how does this actually work? So for this, you can just tell them this authentication includes Kerberos protocol. The NTLM uses an encrypted challenge or response protocol to authorize a user or to authenticate a user. The system requesting authentication performs a calculation that proves it has access to the secured NTLM credentials. In Kerberos, client obtain the Kerberos key distribution center tickets representing the client's network credentials. These tickets are presented to the servers when connections are established. This is how it works. Sometimes when you say to the interviewer how that you have used NTLM authentication, Windows credentials, you have authenticated with the Windows credentials, then you'll be ask this question, right? So it is good to know about it. So let's now use none, and let me name this as maps HTTP client connection close, and let me create the operation. So here let me name this as maps HTTP client operation. I'll be providing the request profile type, whether it is XML or JSON. Response profile type I can select. The content type you can select here, whether it is text by plain, application by XML, application by JSON, whichever you can select it from here. And HTTP method, whether it is get, put, post, or delete, you can select. And here you have written HTTP errors. So you can select written HTTP errors for the errors that are written by the application. And follow redirects. So this follow redirects works in conjunction with the written HTTP errors. You can capture the response header information for the HTTP errors in the trace log and override the process errors. Right? So if follow redirect is off and written HTTP errors is also off, then the response details are not displayed and the process fails with an error. And the follow redirects is off, and if written HTTP errors is on, it displays error status and description if the headers are configured. Clear? And if follow redirects is on and written HTTP errors is off, then it receives responses from alternate locations if listener is down. If follow redirects is on and written HTTP errors is also on, then error messages do not appear in the document properties. It is good to remember this. And written HTTP responses you will be having if it is a send action. Then we have request headers here. The request headers provide information about the HTTP request being performed. Resource path. So the resource paths builds onto the base URL from the client connection. So you'll first have the connection here. So this will be the base URL which you have created here. So this base URL and the path that you're providing here will be continued with this. So now say I want to create this path, right? So now I'll provide all this. So I'll provide till here. I'll say this, and you'll see that JSON or XML I can provide. So these are the parameter values. So for that, what I can do, I can create a variable here. I'll call this format. And when I say is replacement variable here, when I say is replacement variable here, which means I can pass a value to it at runtime. So then again form the request. So see here address equal to. So form this again. Address equal to, and Hyderabad or Bangalore can be provided. This is again a replacement variable. So I'll say address and I'll say is replacement variable, which means when I say these both replacement variables, which means I can pass the values to this at runtime. And then I also have to pass the API key. So I will give this. And I will say API key a replacement variable again. So this is how we have to form the resource path. We have to form the URL. And then we have response headers mapping. It is used to extract the response headers that we get. We can also use response headers to use in subsequent requests. This will be useful when you want to forward server specified values such as CSRF tokens, etc. So now this we are done with operation. Let's save and close this. Save and close this. So we have configured both our connection and operation and place a stop shape. So now we have to pass the parameter values, right? I can again go over here. I'll select parameters and I'll say select format. So format I'll say JSON, and I'll click address. I'll say Bangalore this time. and I can pass the API key. So for that, let me create one API key again over here. This is copied. Select API key and this. So say OK and save. So let's execute this. So see now this is executed and now you can see the output. So see now that is because I have given the API key with space and so we have got error. So now you'll be able to see we've got the output in JSON format. So this is clear. So this is how we consume a REST web service. Here JSON format and this is for city Bangalore. Clear? So now this is how we consume the REST web service. There is a small logic that we'll have to observe over here. So let me close this and say now if I make this a send action, if I have made this a send action and I will create similarly maps send HTTP client operation. So here HTTP method is post, both for post or put. So this applies. So now I'll form the resource path here. So let me form the resource path here. I'll say maps dot apis dot geocode. So the format say is replacement variable, address equal to form the address say is replacement variable and create the API key. And say API key. Name this as is replacement variable. So this is now done. Now let me pass the parameter values. Format I'll say XML. Address I'll say Hyderabad. And API key I'll pass the API key that I have given here. Or let me take it from here. So okay. Now let me execute this. So see now if you have executed this and you'll see that you don't have any output. So it's a blank document. Clear? So it's a blank document here. So for this now what I'll do, I will use a set property here. I'll use a set property here. Observe this. And I'll create dynamic document property. DDP format. So whatever I give the values here is replacement variables. So the same values I need to pass here. So if I open the operation here, if I'm saying this format is replacement variable, I need to give exactly this. Same now for address. So I'll say DDP address. DDP address. And this should be format. And I have the other one as API key. So I'll copy this and I'll call this as dynamic document property API key. Now I'll pass the values here. So this I'll call XML the address Hyderabad, and the API key. So API key, let me select it from here. Okay, I'll delete all this. So API key, I've passed it here. Now, so let me execute this. So this is now executed, and now you'll be able to see the output. So if you click on here, stop shape, and if I click on here, you'll be able to see the output. So see here with respect to Hyderabad and in XML format. So remember that when sending data using an HTTP post or put request, and if you're also setting the replacement variable values, then avoid using the parameters tab in the HTTP client connected tab. So if you are using it, it will result in a blank payload. So a blank payload will be sent from the connector to the endpoint. Instead, you can use a set properties shape and set the dynamic document properties before the HTTP client shape, as we have done now. This is clear. Also, one thing you'll have to remember that if you go to operation here, check this return HTTP errors and return HTTP responses as well to see the output. Clear? And one thing again, so say now we are using a get action. So let's go back to the old version. Let me go back to the old version. So if you are using this and say there is some error, or let me execute this. So now this is executed. If there's any error and if you want to see what URL is being formed, if you go here, so see this is a so let me go back and let me select, instead of send action, I'll select get action here. I'll select this and I'll give the parameter values. Format JSON. I'll select address and I'll give Bangalore. And I'll select API key and I'll give the value to this. Okay, so this is now done. So let me execute this. So this is now executed and you'll be able to see the output. You'll be able to see the output. In order to find what URL is being formed, if you go to log here, you'll be able to see the URL formed. So by this you can understand if the right URL is being hit or no. If any issues in the parameters that are being passed, you'll be able to find. Clear? So you have to check the process logs for it. If it is a send action, you'll not be able to see the URL found, but if it is a get action, you'll be able to see this URL formed. So with this, we have completed consuming the SOAP web service and the REST web service. Clear? So that's the end of our session. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.